Highdown as a hill is quite special in terms of geology. You all know the South Downs, don't you, generally? Do you know Cissbury, Chanctonbury? Yeah. Okay, the South Downs are the hills that are in Sussex. So if ever you're driving in Sussex and you see any hills, they're the South Downs. That's what the hills are called. And there are North Downs, which are in the north, in Surrey, but we've got the South Downs in Sussex, yeah.
Don't the South Downs go to Hampshire as well?
They do, you're right, yes, they go as far as Winchester. So they start at Eastbourne at Beachy Head and they finish in Hampshire at Winchester. Now this hill is part of the South Downs National Park, but actually, in truth, it's not really part of the South Downs. This is all that remains of a line of hills that existed about 120 million years ago, and all the other hills were eroded away by time, by the sea or by ice ages, when we had times of intense cold and frozen rivers called glaciers ground away all the rock that was beneath them. So this hill is a much older hill than the other hills. It's about twice as old as the rest of the South Downs. Now there's a way you can tell that this is part of a different line of hills, and it's not an obvious way, but once you know it, you won't forget. If you go to the South Downs, all the other hills in Sussex, you'll find that the slope on the south is a gentle slope, whereas the slope on the north is a steep slope. But with Highdown, it's the opposite. This is the steep slope that you come up in the car, and the gentle slope is to the north. And that's because it was a completely different set of hills. So the chalk beneath us is about 120 million years old.
Like a chalk cliff over there. It's like a massive drop over there.
Yeah, and there's chalk quarries.
Yeah.
There's also in the gardens, there's lovely gardens behind Highdown's house that we won't go in today, but you can go back later with your family, and there's a chalk pit in there. Here's a question: does anyone know what chalk is formed from, or have a guess as to what it's formed from?
I knew this one, so I forgot.
What do you think?
Is it made from coal?
No, it's not coal yet.
It's made from fish.
Yeah, and which part of fish?
I can't remember.
Which is the bit you think is most likely to survive in any animal?
The ribs.
Yeah.
The bone.
The bones. So what chalk is that over millions and millions of years, which is hard to imagine, isn't it? Huge amount of time, as marine animals, fish, whales, dinosaurs going back long enough, when they died, their bodies fell to the bottom of the ocean, all the flesh rotted away, but the bones remained. And then you get bones on top of bones on top of bones, and all the pressure crushes the bones together, and over millions of years, that creates chalk. So when we're walking on Highdown or any of the downs, we're in a way walking on a massive graveyard of marine animals that lived millions and millions of years ago. What's the other thing about chalk? Thinking of chalk as a rock, how is it different from other rocks? Yeah.
It's incredibly soft.
Incredibly soft, exactly. It's one of the softest rocks there is. Now, our fingernails aren't particularly hard. You couldn't scratch a piece of iron with your fingernail, could you? But you can scratch chalk with your fingernails. So chalk is less hard than your fingernails. It's a very, very soft rock. And that means it's very porous. Anyone know what porous means? Yeah.
It's got a lot of holes in it.
Sort of. It means water easily goes through it. So that is because it's a soft rock. And yes, effectively you're right. There's lots of little holes in the molecules. So if you built a house of chalk, it wouldn't last very long. If you built a house of granite that's a very hard rock, that will still be standing in 1,000 years' time and it'll look exactly the same as when you built it. Okay, so before we walk up to the hill, I want to talk about this building, which is now called the Highdown, but it's had other names, and it was originally built in about 1840, and it was called Highdown Towers. Even though it's really only got one tower, it was still called Towers with an S. And it was built by a family called Lyons, Lyon, and they're related to the present Queen, Queen Elizabeth. Her mother was also Elizabeth, and her family were the Bowes-Lyons. So these were like distant cousins, and they owned Goring Hall, which is now a hospital down in Goring, and they built this just so that their friends could come and stay and enjoy going up onto the downs. And in 1909 it was bought by a man called Sir Frederick Stern, and Sir Frederick Stern is famous as a plant collector, and he collected plants that grew on chalk, because when he bought this house, at the back, like one of you was saying about chalk quarries, at the back in the garden there's a huge chalk quarry, and he thought, oh, I don't like this bare chalk, I'd like to plant flowers. And people said, nothing grows on chalk, you're wasting your time. So he asked all his friends to give him any plants that they thought grew well on chalk, and he started planting them. And so the beautiful garden you see today is all a result of his work over years and years and years of collecting plants that grow well on chalk. Now looking at the house, can you see what it's built of? Mainly what it's built of? Yeah. Rocks, yeah. Anyone know what sort of rock? Yeah. Flint, yeah. And it's a really strange thing, this, but you find flint inside chalk. And it's a strange thing, because chalk's one of the softest rocks, but flint is one of the hardest rocks. Flint is harder than iron. You can scratch iron with flint. So it's a bit peculiar that flint occurs in chalk. And some people think the flint also comes from the animals, but from the bits of animals, if it was us, like our fingernails and our hair, have silicon in. And if you think about it, your hair is very different from the rest of you, isn't it? You look at your skin, look at your eyes. It's a funny stuff, hair. And so they think the pressure over millions of years created flint also out of animal remains. So if you're building something, it's good to build it of flint, because the flint's very hard. But they used to build flint houses using chalk mortar, and the chalk's soft. So once all the bits around the flint start to flake and crumble, what's going to happen to the flints? They're going to fall out, and then you have to constantly update the mortar, because if you don't look after those gaps between the flints where the sort of cement is, if you don't look after that, the building starts to fall down. So that's been standing there for 170 years. And it's no longer the home of Sir Frederick Stern, it's now a hotel and a restaurant. We're going to walk up to see the miller's tomb, and I'll talk to you about that. So if you all stick together, a bit of walking to do, and watch out for cars. So got a big panel here telling you all about the South Downs National Park. So, and here on the map, see in green, it shows that the South Downs is very large. That's a long distance from Beachy Head to Winchester, and it's very thin to begin with, and then it gets wider and wider as very few houses here, very few big towns. Most of the big towns are outside the national park, like Worthing on the coast, and Brighton and Bognor. So what I'm going to talk to you about now is a legend. So what's a legend? Someone who has an art. Yes, you.
A legend is a story which can be real.
Exactly, yeah. It's often a mixture of truth and fiction. So the man who's buried here, I can tell you things about him that are definitely true. Then I can tell you things about him that might be true. And then I can tell you things about him that are almost certainly fantastical nonsense, but amuses people, okay? So the facts are that the man buried here was called John Oliver. And as some of you have seen, his dates are on the side. And he died in 1793, aged 84 years. Now I expect quite a lot of you in your families will have grandparents or great aunts or uncles who are of that age. Have you?
Yeah.
Or maybe even older than 84.
Quite old for 1795.
Exactly. It's very old for 1793.
Most people would die in their 50s back then.
Absolutely, yeah. I probably wouldn't be here standing now if I was in the 18th century, so I'm glad I'm in the 21st century. But you're right, people died very young because there were so many illnesses for which there were no cure. So him living to 84 is amazing. And also he was a miller, and he wasn't like he was a lord or an aristocrat or a king. And his windmill was right on the top of Highdown Hill. It's not there anymore, but when we go to the top of the hill, I'll show you where his windmill used to be, and then I can point to you where the new windmill was built, which isn't a windmill anymore. It's been made into a house, but the building is still there. So John Oliver was a miller, we know that for sure, and he was buried here. But this is a bit odd, isn't it? Because no one else is buried here, just him. And most people are buried where? Graveyard or churchyard. So very strange that he's buried here. Now he used to live in a cottage that was just to the north over there. There's nothing left of it, it's completely fallen down, disappeared. But that's where he lived. So these are facts. He was a miller, he lived in the 18th century, his mill was on top of the hill, he lived in a cottage. Yes?
What's a miller?
Oh, what's a miller? Okay. Does anyone know what a miller is? Yeah.
A person who works in a windmill.
So flour that makes bread and cakes is ground from grain, and that's in a windmill. So he ground flour, and he could make quite a good living. It wasn't a bad job. But when he died in 1793, aged 84, in his will, that's when someone dies, they've written before they die the things that they want to happen to all their possessions. He owned 6 or 7 big houses in and around Worthing. Well, that was a bit odd, wasn't it, really, for someone who was a miller to have had enough money to buy all these houses. And when he died and his funeral took place, 2,000 people came here to the funeral. That's a lot of people, 2,000. But that was at a time when far less people, you come to join the talk. So 2,000 people came to the funeral. But in those days, you look at Worthing, you can see it, can't you, all spread out, how huge Worthing is. Does anyone know how many people live in Worthing, or can you have a guess? Yeah. 104, I think that's spot on, yeah, 104,000 people. Anyone imagine how many people were living in Worthing in 1793?
A lot.
What do you think?
5,000.
You almost, I thought you were going to get it then. Anyone else? Yes?
10,000.
No. The 5 bit was the right bit.
6,000.
Yeah? 50?
No, 5,000.
It's 500.
Oh, it's about 4.
Yeah.
2,000 people came to these funerals.
Yeah, so the 500 people living in Worthing. The little villages around here, like Goring and Ferring, which aren't villages now, they're big. They may have had 200 or 300 people. So what it means is that just about everyone living around here came to his funeral. So he must have been very, very popular and very much loved. Now those are the facts, and now we come on to the legend part of it. The thing that may be true or may not be true.
Wait, maybe I think I know. Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe he was like the only source of flour in the rest of the villages. So when he died, that everyone knew him because they bought flour off him. So when he died, everyone attended it.
That
could be possible.
It could be possible. It
But
could
he was
be.
the only source of flour.
Yeah.
And then when he died, everyone knew about him because they
I'm
only
thinking
bought flour off him.
2,000 people going to a funeral. If that was up here, that would take up most of the hillside.
Take up a huge, and there was, and he left money
It
for a
would be
party.
visible from space.
He left money
Well,
for.
it would be visible from the air, definitely.
It'd be visible, yes, from the air.
Probably not from space. You'd need to zoom in.
You would probably. You probably would. But he left
everyone
money
knew
for them to have a big party. So lots of drink and lots of food, and 3 young women dressed in white with yellow ribbons carried his coffin to its resting place. And there was so much drink that a lot of the people who came to the funeral got drunk and there was a bit of a riot, and so that was recorded in the local newspapers, so we know that's true. But this is the legend bit. The legend is, that may be true or may not be true, is that he wasn't only a miller, he was doing something else.
Was he like a hitman?
No, I don't think he was a hitman, but he was doing something that was against the law.
Was he
Any ideas? Yes.
Selling drugs.
Well, that's interesting you should say that, because what he was doing was a bit similar to what drug sellers do now. Yeah?
illegally selling alcohol?
Illegally selling alcohol. He was a smuggler, and a smuggler was someone who brought alcohol from France across the sea in a boat and sold it in England. And you may think, well, why would that make money? Because in this country there was a tax on alcohol and there was a tax on other things, so that the government had money. And the smugglers thought, well, if we bring it in without telling the government, we can sell it and we'll make the money. And when the government realised what was happening, they sent soldiers to try and stop the smugglers. But the smugglers were much more clever than the soldiers or the customs officers or the excise men, who were all government officials whose job it was to stop smuggling.
So didn't Britain not really like France at that time?
It didn't like France, no. And lots of wars with France, and that made things a lot more tricky.
Yeah, because like nobody really wanted to, because like also that might also be why the government, that's also why you couldn't really get it, because France probably didn't want to trade a bunch of alcohol with Britain, so they decided to, so basically they had a monopoly if you were a smuggler, so you could trade it for more money.
That's really good. That's right. It's and when France and Britain were at war, the French government thought, well, this is bad for the English government. If we help the smugglers, that's really not good news for the English government. Yeah.
Didn't he like live through like the 7 Years' War, the American Revolution and the French Revolution?
He did.
War.
Yeah, he did. You're right. All three of those wars, and he died. He died just after the execution of the French king. So these were very dramatic times in history, very violent, turbulent times when there was lots of change and governments felt very vulnerable. So they didn't like smugglers and they didn't like what they were doing. It was said that John Oliver used his windmill to help the smugglers. Now you have to really think laterally here to think how you could use a windmill to help smugglers. You think of the sails of a windmill, the bits on the windmill that go round and round, and you think where the windmill was, on top of the hill looking out to...
You could look up for any soldiers.
You could. That's all true.
And windmills turn around, so you can have a 360 view
Yeah.
and see all the soldiers coming in, so you can tell them to hide.
That's all absolutely true.
I just don't know about sails. So.
Well, what it's alleged is that when smuggling boats were out in the sea,
Send signals.
they send signals, yeah, using the sails to send signals, because they didn't want to bring this alcohol, which was illegally brought in, was called contraband. And contraband wasn't just alcohol, it could also be tobacco or tea or fine clothes or anything that had a tax on it. So the smugglers were out at sea in their boats with the contraband, but they didn't want to come ashore and unload it if there were going to be excise men or customs men or soldiers. And it's said that when John Oliver saw the boats out there, if it was safe for them to land, he would set his sails at a cross like that. It was safe. If it wasn't safe, he'd set them like that. And that's how they knew. Now, we don't know that's a fact, but that's the story that's grown up. And that he was an important smuggler. And that's why he was popular. Not so much because he gave the people who lived here free drink, more because a lot of the people who lived here he gave work to, because people, when the smuggling boats came and landed, someone had to come down and take all the cargo off the boats, and then they had to carry it inland, and then they had to take it to safe places to hide it, and they were paid to do that. And the men who sailed over to France and came back again were paid to do that. So if John Oliver was an important smuggler, he was probably giving lots of work to lots of people. And that's why so many people came to his funeral, and that's why he was so rich and left all these houses in his will when he died. One of these houses still stands, and you can find it. Do you all know Tarring High Street? Tarring, where the parsonage restaurant is? It's the only really old street in Worthing. Very, very old. And there's a big house there called the Hollies. And when John Oliver died, he left that to his niece, Maria Hedgecock, and her husband. So I've told you the facts, and I've told you the legend, and now I'm going to tell you the really silly stuff. One of these stories was that when they buried John Oliver, they buried him upside down. Because in one of his poems that he wrote, he said, "At the end of the world, all the graves will be open, and the world will be turned upside down, and only the good will be standing straight." And so he was buried upside down to make sure that when the world was turned upside down, he'd be the only one standing the right way. But that's definitely not true, because about 60 years ago, when this was falling down a bit, archaeologists dug down and found he was buried completely normally. The other silly legend and story.
I got a question. Imagine if that was actually like a real prophecy, like at the end of the world, like we live to the end of the world, and then suddenly we find out like all the graves are being opened up by like big explosives and stuff.
Yeah,
Everyone's
well,
coming out.
that would certainly be a shock, wouldn't it?
And then all the good people are like trying to know what to do.
And they turn into zombies, and then they try to kill all the bad people.
You can see how these stories arise, can't they? Look at your own imagination, how these stories arise. Well, the other one is that if you run round this tomb backwards, which would be hard to do now, because look how the tree and the nettles have grown in on it. But when I was a boy, this was very much on its own. This tree wasn't nearly as big. It was much easier to go round the whole thing. If you run round the tomb backwards 7 times, the devil will appear and give you a bowl of soup.
Can I do it?
Yeah, well, try it later under controlled circumstances, because I don't know what I'd do if the devil turned up with a bowl of soup. No, it's not on the risk assessment, bringing in the devil. The last thing to tell you about this before we move on is how is it's here? Because John Oliver, although he owned the windmill, he didn't own this land, he didn't own the whole hill, so how is it here? So you'd had to have got the permission of 2 important people to build his tomb here. One was the local vicar, the Reverend Penfold, Vicar of Goring. He would have to give him permission, and he'd had to have come up here to consecrate the ground. That means make the ground holy. You can only bury in consecrated ground. So he must have been a good friend of the vicar, and the other person he must have been a good friend of is the man who did own the land, and his name was Westbrook Richardson, and he lived in a big house called Findon Place. And if you go to the Findon, north of Worthing, and you find Findon Church, close to Findon Church is a great big house that's now flats, luxury flats, but that was originally Findon Place, and that's where Westbrook Richardson lived. So here was a miller who was obviously very good friends with the vicar and very good friends with a wealthy landowner. So I wonder if perhaps they were involved in the smuggling as well. It's quite possible.
Or maybe they were buyers.
Well, maybe they might have been. Yeah, they might have been.
Though, back then, a vicar wouldn't normally be an alcoholic.
Oh, weren't supposed to be, but I think they still were.
Maybe
They
they could
thought
have
it
just
was
been
unholy.
friends. They could have just been friends. Like generally, they could just be good friends. Or maybe he could have paid them. I mean, he had 6 houses, so he's probably quite wealthy. So they might have paid them to do it. Like
He might have paid them for the land. That's quite true. The other interesting thing is that he had the tomb built. He had this tomb built 40 years before he died. So he was in his 40s when he had it built, and he died when he was 84. And there's also a legend that when it was empty, because he was still alive,
In 100
he
years,
stored contraband
people
inside the
still haven't
tomb.
burnt it down.
No, who is going to open up a
Yeah, I
tomb
sat on
to
that.
look for
We can all go
contraband?
away
No
from
one's
today and
gonna
say,
do
yeah,
that.
that's the devil's throne. We'll make up our own folklore,
Yeah, well,
our own
I
story.
don't think the Customs and Excise had Lara Croft working for them. You can see there are still areas that are fields, but I wonder when, you know, in 30, 40 years' time, when you're grown up with your own families, will those fields still be there, or will they be full of houses? And then it could be a bit unpleasant, couldn't it? Without any green spaces. Yes?
It would have been filled with houses because more people would have moved into.
If you look over this way to where Chris is, now you can see the trees. Now between us and the trees, what do you notice about the landscape? Bumpy, yeah. It's raised. And any idea why or what that is? Some people call it a hill fort, but I think that is a misleading term because we don't really know what it was. But what you're looking at is an earth embankment, a mound of earth that goes all the way around the top of the hill, and in front of the earthwork is a ditch. Now, when that was first built, the bank would have been higher and the ditch would have been deeper.
Can I have a look?
Yeah, we'll go up and have a look in a minute.
Yeah, the bank would have fallen. Some of the bank would have fallen down into the ditch.
Yes,
obviously, and
make
the rest
it-
of it would
yeah.
have eroded away.
It would have eroded away, that's right. So that was built 3,000 years ago. So if you think of the house we were looking at, the Flint House, Highdown Towers, 170 years old. Well, 170 years seems quite a lot when you think of how long a human life is, but 3,000 years, that's going way, way, way back. And the people who were living here on this land at that time were completely different people to who we are. We're all descended from all sorts of races and cultures, but they were from something that really doesn't exist anymore, or if it does, it's all been merged with other people. It's such a long time ago, and it's referred to as the Bronze Age. There was the Neanderthals, they died out. The Neanderthals and the Paleolithic people. These were the Bronze Age people, sometimes called the Beaker people. And they're pretty obvious reasons why we talk about the Bronze Age and Beaker people. Bronze, because the tools they used were made of bronze, and Beaker people because they made beakers out of clay. So clay cups, which doesn't sound amazing, but it was more sophisticated than what had been before. So these people, although they lived long, long ago, they weren't stupid. They were as clever as we are, but they knew different things. They obviously don't know the things we know, but they knew things that we probably don't know. And they had this ability to build and construct quite impressive monuments with very basic and limited tools. But it is important though to remember that although they lived long ago, that they were certainly as naturally as intelligent as us, but they were using their intelligence in a different way for different reasons. So this thing they built, they used to call it a hill fort, like a castle, but no one really knows that for sure. It might not have been a castle, and there are two other things it could have been used for. So if you think, so the ditch goes all the way round and the embankment goes all the way round. If you built something like that, what do you think you might use it for? Yeah.
Enclosing something in it, keeping something out of it.
Yes, yes. So what might you enclose in it? Go on. Animals. And so you enclose the, what sort of animals would you enclose inside? Yeah? Yeah, so animals that you were using, either as work animals or for food animals. And what animals might you want to keep out? Yeah. Wild animals, yeah. Predators.
If you had a herd of sheep, you wouldn't want them.
No, and there were lots of wolves at those days.
Yeah,
Wolves and
bears, wolves. I think at some point we even had lions.
yeah, that's way before this, way before this. I don't even think there were bears in the Bronze Age, but there were definitely wolves. Wolves were the real fear. Packs of wolves get in, they'd kill everything. So it could have been for animals to keep them safe. It could have been a hill fort, and there's one other thing it could have been. Going back, thinking what we were talking about at the tomb, and what do lots of people need to believe in their lives? Churches, yeah. So these people probably had a religion, but we don't know what it was because they didn't have writing. Archaeologists have dug into the middle looking for ancient relics. But I think the main thing, whatever it was used for, one thing is obvious, and it was obvious as soon as we got here and we looked. What is the amazing thing about being here that it strikes you straight away? Yeah. You can see loads of stuff. So it could have been a hill fort, it could have been an animal enclosure, it could have been a religious place, and it could have been all three. It could have been all three. And maybe something else we haven't even thought of. So let's go up and have a closer look now.
Basically half of them trees. What if I did?
So there's two different bits of history to the top of Highdown. There's the bit I just told you about from the Bronze Age, and that was 3,000 years ago. So I'm now bringing you to about 1,600 years ago. And at that time, see that this country's had all sorts of different people coming in and leaving and moving.
Including the Romans.
Including the Romans. And the Romans were here, and the Romans built villas, Fishbourne and Bigner. Although interestingly, they weren't actually built for people who were Romans, who were Italians. They were built for people living here who welcomed the Romans, who supported the Romans, and as a reward, they were given these beautiful villas to live in.
Didn't the Romans call everyone that wasn't them barbarians?
They did.
Yeah, they called literally anyone who didn't use their way of life a barbarian.
They
Apart
did.
from that, I mean, Greeks were considered enemies of Rome and that. But
Yeah,
then
they definitely weren't
ancient Greeks and Romans were called barbarians. Like Gauls, even though they were quite crazy in fighting, they were actually quite a civilized society.
Though they did often run into battle in the nude.
But then they were actually quite a civilized society.
That's why they kept on winning with most of them. Didn't even bother to fight them.
Battle's not very civilised, you might as well do it in the nude.
You'd have to hope the battle was in the summer though, wouldn't you?
It generally was quite
Yeah.
civilized because like they had like general cooking pots and clay making things, and then the Romans thought of them as unwashed barbarians that need to be replaced by good and true Roman culture.
Yeah,
And the Romans had gold.
Romans, it was in the Romans' interest when the Romans wrote about these people, they weren't going to write about them in a good way, because they were going to write about them in a bad way to justify what they'd done to them. The good thing about the Romans was, though, that anyone could be a Roman citizen. It didn't matter what your race was, you didn't have to be an Italian to be a Roman. As long as you supported them, yeah, and helped their cause.
As long as you were with their emperor at the time.
Yeah.
Which is why many people were not considered Romans when Nero came about.
And some of their other emperors that were pretty awful.
Like Caligula.
Yes.
And then there was the Greeks that considered everyone else barbarians, the ancient Greece.
So it's an old idea, but in the end the Romans left, and the people who were living here felt very vulnerable because the Romans had protected them, and
They were a big fat army, and we were not really.
they didn't have an army.
The
So
Vikings had a weird time in here because they basically pushed us in, we pushed them out, and then it just kept going back and forth until
It was
eventually
like a big
Vikings-
game of it was a big backwards game of tug and of war.
Vikings weren't here. I don't want to confuse everyone.
I know,
So,
1,000 years AD instead of.
so this is about 500 AD I'm talking. So 500 AD. So who would have been the people coming here then? 450, 500 AD. Yeah.
Actually, English.
Anglo-Saxon
The English language is made up of kind of like Roman, Latin, and also some.
That's why all the scientific
Northern
names
of the
are.
Vikings.
and also some Germanic because of the Anglo-Saxons
Yeah.
and some Celt.
Yeah, so it's the Anglo-Saxons who were primarily coming in at that time. And do you know Northbrook College? Northbrook College, just out of view, really. There used to be a big villa there, big Roman villa, and the people who were living there felt very vulnerable. So they paid people to come in to protect them. They paid for soldiers mercenaries. Yeah, mercenaries.
Didn't the Anglo-Saxons stop because they were trying to escape the Mongol horde, but the Romans didn't give them any land, so they had to try and take it for themselves.
And also that a lot of their land was disappearing because sea levels were rising. So that was one of the reasons they came over here looking for new land. But the people in the Roman villa, they paid them to protect them from other raiders or pirates. And these Anglo-Saxons buried their dead here. Of people buried with their shield and their spear, showing that they were warriors and fighters. But they obviously weren't fighting the people at the villa because there's no evidence of that. They were probably here to protect them. And perhaps at some point the people in the villa ran out of money to pay them, so instead they gave them land. So perhaps they gave them this land, and this is where they had their cemetery. So this is, beneath our feet is one of the largest Anglo-Saxon cemeteries in the whole of Britain. And a lot was learned about.
Most of us are probably standing above a few dead bodies.
Probably, more than likely.
There's also a rabbit dropping right there.
And Anglo-Saxon men were usually buried with a spear and a shield. Now, this is a tricky question. What do you think Anglo-Saxon women were often buried with?
Children.
Well, they could be if the children had died. Sure, yeah.
Pots and pans and
It could be buried with pots, but thinking like the man was buried with a spear, think of something else that's metal.
I think the women's carried like. I think there was actually like in the basically. I don't know if this is true, but I think there was like women warriors that weren't good at fighting at all, but they had really loud screams to try and terrify the enemy, to demoralise them, and then the real fighters came in, but then the women still like fought, but they weren't very good at it.
Well, we don't know is the answer. Who is actually doing the fighting all the time? Yes. Shovels, that's a good idea. They might have been. I'll tell you what it is, and it's probably a pretty hard thing to guess. It's always easy when you know. They were buried with keys. Because they had the keys to the houses. So they decided when the house was locked up and when it was unlocked. And that the key was, and a very powerful Anglo-Saxon woman may have a bunch of keys. So she had the keys to various houses, showing her authority and her status. So you can see that the division between men and women at that time was that the women ran the homes, they were in charge of it, they decided what happened in the home, they even decided when the door was locked and unlocked. The men were involved probably in the farming and probably in fighting, but it's hard to know for sure.
Either that or it's symbolic.
Symbolic, but it'd still be symbolic of something, wouldn't it?
Yeah, like it could be symbolic that they own the house, but it doesn't mean they technically know when it's unlocked or locked. So it could just be symbolic that they own the house.
And the spear could be symbolic as well. Not necessarily they did fighting, but potentially they could have done.
Yeah.
So there's, if you can remember two things about the archaeology, the prehistory here, there's the Bronze Age enclosure, which is the ditch and the embankment, which is 3,000 years old, and then there's the Anglo-Saxon cemetery that's 1,500 years old. So then they're at completely different times. They're not the same time.
They're using the same place.
They're using the same place. And probably for the same reason, because it's still got this brilliant view, hasn't it? It still has all those strategic elements that make it attractive.
And to be fair, like a big old floating log of metal armour, so it probably just could happen. And it's not very good when you're running up a hill and.
Yeah, you're right. That is
I've been down there and I got exhausted.
That's the windmill they built after John Oliver's windmill. So is that the one you're looking at with the tall pointy thing?
Yeah.
So that is the second windmill, and the reason they built it down, why do you think they might have built it further down the hill? Because John Oliver's windmill, see behind Chris where all the tall grass is, just behind him, that's where John Oliver's windmill stood. Any idea what happened to it? Why is it not there now?
It would have probably fell down.
Yeah, and what would make something fall down more than anything? Yeah? Bad weather, such as?
Storms,
Yeah.
Hurricanes.
tornadoes.
Exactly. That's what happened. There was a huge storm and the windmill was smashed to the ground. And when they decided to rebuild it, they thought, we're not going to rebuild it on the top of the hill, we'll build it down the bottom of the hill. So John Oliver's windmill's gone. That's the one they built afterwards. And his was built of wood, whereas that one's built of bricks. And it's now a private house and someone lives in it. Yeah.
I know why they built it there, because they knew that if they built it there, then it would get crushed again.
I think so. And also, it's just reminded me, talking about the folklore and the legends and the unbelievable stories. The legend was that when the windmill was blown down, which one of you was talking about the grinding stones for the windmill? Was it? Yeah, you were. Yeah. So the story is that when the windmill fell down, one of the grinding stones rolled down the hill on its side like a big penny, like a ball going round and round and round. It rolled right down to the bottom of the hill and killed someone. And there's still a pub near Angmering called the Roundstone, and it hasn't got it anymore, but it used to have a picture of a skeleton under a mill wheel. But that's not very likely to be true, is it? The chances of a great big heavy...
No, there is a chance that it rolled down and landed where the windmill is.
That's just about possible, yeah.
Which means that might be the reason they decided to put it
Yeah.
there.
How would it be? It wouldn't be also possible because you would have just ran away.
You would, wouldn't you? You wouldn't just wait to be hit by a rolling...
Can you hate them?
Yeah, they would only like that bit.
Also, if there's a hurricane and that's what knocked it down, I don't think you'd be having a nice walk like this slowly during a hurricane.
Now, the only way it could be true, I suppose, is if it rolled down and someone was sitting in their cottage and it smashed through the window and hit them.
Or what they might have just been.
It probably would have done.
That would have ripped you
But
to
it's
pieces.
probably very unlikely to be true. So people have been looking at this. Any idea what this is?
Got a big old foot on that.
It's made of concrete.
Looks like a sundial.
It looks like a
the actual
sundial,
dial.
but it's not a sundial.
Looks like also something you have water
Yeah.
running in because it's hot.
Yes, it marks the highest point. This is the highest point on Highdown. You can't get higher than this. That's good news, Chris. It's all downhill from now.
Unless you climb a tree.
Unless you climb a tree. And this has got a name. It's called a Triangulation Point.
Also, it looks like water went through these bits because that's gone.
Well, that would have been,
Green.
equipment would have been put on there. Now, these were built by the Ordnance Survey, and the Ordnance Survey are the official map makers of Britain, and they've been the official map makers since the time of the wars with France that we were talking about down at the Miller's
What war?
grave. The
There's a lot of
Napoleonic War.
Oh, the
Napoleonic Wars.
Coalition Wars.
Yes, that one. And the British government thought, well, if the French invade, we won't know where they are, and we don't even know where things are because we haven't got proper maps of our own country. So they created the Ordnance Survey to create very reliable, accurate maps. And at some point, these were put up so that the people who made the maps, I mean, today you make maps, don't you, from aerial photographs? But in those days, they used equipment, thelodoscope, is that right? I'm trying to think what. Theodolite, yes. Which was and you'd put that on here, and then you'd match it up to the next one. So if you look ahead, can you see on the distance, on the horizon of the hills, there's two aerials sticking up. You've got to look very carefully.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's Bignor Hill, so that's got one of these on as well, and they'd have matched that up, and then they could have totally worked out the height and the distance in between. So that's why these were built. They're not used anymore because it's all done from digital satellite
I
imaging.
bet if you did a cross.
Have you noticed, looking out, how far you can see? Can you see in the far distance across the sea? Can you see there's some land rising up? Does anyone know where that is?
Isle of Wight? Is it Spain or France?
No, it's the Isle of Wight.
That's quite far away.
Yeah, that.
Been there.
From this part of Highdown, you can see as far as the Isle of Wight, and on the other side, as we're going back down, you probably won't see it today because it's a bit hazy, but on a good day you can see Beachy Head. And from Beachy Head to the Isle of Wight must be 80 miles. It's a long, long way. And here's the thing, look, if you look right straight ahead, right on the far horizon, can you see a little spike pointing up? That's the spire of Chichester Cathedral, and that's 20 miles away. Yeah. So,
And I bet if we actually took the time to do it, we could probably walk there as well.
if it's, well, at least it would be flat, wouldn't it?
I'm not walking 20 miles.
Be good for your legs though.
Not really.
So the last thing I'm going to say is that even now, in our modern times, people still come up to Highdown, and every year on the 21st of June, which is the summer solstice, people come up here and they light a bonfire and they have dancing. Yes.
That's like before. That's usually like after my birthday,
Oh, when's your birthday?
the 19th.
Okay, yeah. So 21st of June, they always come up here and they have Morris dances and they light a small bonfire and they have singing. But I think it was cancelled this year because of COVID, and it was cancelled last year. And for many, many years, there was a tradition at Midsummer to build a bonfire on the top of this hill and light it as the sun went down and keep it burning until the sun came up the next morning. And that's an old tradition you find all over Scandinavia and Northern Europe.